So in this video, we're going to look at the manual settings of your DSLR camera. Now there's something called the exposure triangle, and we're going to look at each side of the triangle because each element will make your picture lighter and darker. So that's your exposure. So you want to make sure you have a nice video image that's not too dark, but also not too bright. Now to get access to these three elements, you've got to make sure that your camera's set to manual. So on the top, there might be a dial that you'll need to switch, make sure it's in video mode, but also make sure on the dial it's switched to M, not P or auto or A for aperture or shutter priority. But also you might need to go into the menu just to make sure the exposure is set to manual. And you'll know whether it is in manual mode because at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to access or be able to see ISO, shutter speed and aperture. So we're going to look at those individually and then talk about how you'll decide which settings you'll need for the type of video that you're trying to create. So let's look at ISO. Now ISO is a sensitivity of the sensor to light. Now normally it starts about 100, and as you increase the ISO, which might be a case of spinning a dial, or perhaps on the top of the camera there might be an ISO button. Hopefully on the back of the screen it will come up with some numbers, and as you increase the ISO you'll see that the picture gets brighter. So sometimes cameras can go up to 12,000 or 25,000, but essentially the lighting isn't changing in the environment you're in now. So really what is changing is just the sensitivity of the sensor to light. Now the problem is as you increase the ISO, the picture will get more noisy or grainy. So often you might not see it on the back of the screen now, but when you come to editing, in the dark areas of the image, there might be some moving dots. So to keep your image quality as good as possible, what you really need to do is keep the ISO right down. So that would probably be 100 or 200. Now for most shoots, it's going to be under 1,000. Now every camera will be slightly different in terms of how high you can go with the ISO, but generally, if I'm relying on the ISO, and I'm up to sort of over 1,000, up to 3,200, I might think, right, I need to open up the shutters or go to a place where there's a little bit more light, or perhaps even set up some lights. So normally though, for most people when you're shooting, it's going to be under 1,000 for your ISO. Now, let's talk about shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is actually a time-based thing. So sometimes on some cameras, you might see 1 over a certain number. Now in photography, it's a creative tool because if you want to freeze action, you'll use a fast shutter speed. So that might be 1/200th of a second, for instance. Now in videography, it's a lot easier. We just keep it at 50 or 1 over 50, 1/50th. Now the reason for that is because in Australia, we're using a TV system called PAL. In America, they use NTSC. Now with PAL, it's based on 25 frames per second. Whereas in America and NTSC, it's 30 frames a second. Now, they realized a long time ago to make motion look correct, like motion blur, that you need a shutter speed that's twice of your frame rate. So if you're shooting at 25 frames per second, you might see on your camera it says 25p, then you have a shutter speed of 1/50th. So sometimes in American tutorials, they might be talking about 1/60th. That's because they're using 30 frames per second, so they'd have a shutter speed of 1/60th. So for us, and you'll need to go in and check what your movie record size is, and we can cover that in a different video. But for now, we're just going to make sure the shutter speed is at 1/50th. Now, if it's on something different, as you lower it down, it might be on 1/200th, for instance, the picture may get brighter. So as you increase the shutter speed, the picture will be darker. But for videography, we're just going to keep it at 1/50th. The last part of the triangle is the aperture. Now every lens will be slightly different, but basically the aperture is how big the hole is inside the lens. So normally it goes up to f/22, it's measured in f-stops. f/22 is a small hole, so that's the confusing thing. The larger the number, the smaller the hole, and then your lens will be able to open up, the aperture will open up, letting more light into the camera and hitting the sensor. And that lens, your lens might go down to f3.5 or f2.8, or you might have a small prime lens, for instance, like a 50mm, and you might have a lens that lets in lots of light, f1.8. Now, the interesting thing about aperture is as you change the aperture, you change something called the depth of field. So what that means is if you want to have a nice blurry background, you'll open up the aperture as wide as possible. So lots of light will come in, so you might need to adjust the ISO. But what you'll get at a wide open aperture is a very shallow depth of field. So what that means is only a portion of the image is in focus, which means the background's out of focus. So that's the type of setting I'll use for interviews. The same as a portrait in photography, you want the person in focus, but you want the background out of focus so that the viewer isn't distracted by the environment they're in, which could be, people looking at the room or the office or the bookshelf behind them. The viewer will just concentrate on the person speaking. So just to bring it all together, and in terms of all the settings, if I'm doing an interview, for instance, I'm going to open up my aperture as wide as possible, so the lowest number. So on this lens, it's f2.8. Then I'll set my ISO just to compensate. So depending on what the aperture is, you'll just need to change the ISO to make sure you get a nicely exposed image. And you'll just be looking at the back of the screen. There are also tools to help you, depending on the camera you've got. And then we're going to make sure that the shutter speed is still set to 1/50th. So that's how I use the exposure triangle. And I'm thinking of this every time I go to a new environment. I'll bring up the exposure triangle in my mind and just work my way round the triangle and set my camera up accordingly. If I'm not doing an interview and I'm just doing some extra shots, then I'll just change the aperture. So if I'm shooting into a shadowed area, I might open up the aperture to let more light in. But if I'm shooting into the sun, I might need to close the aperture down or start to use a filter like a variable ND filter. And we can talk about filters later. But the manual settings are really important. It just means you get control over the camera, and also the camera's not changing. So if people move in the shot, the picture and the exposure is not going to change. You just get a lot more consistency when you're doing video work.